Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. Hello. And I hope you're all well on this this other sunny day in April. Bit of a cold wind down here in Worthing, where I am, on the 22nd of April 2021 as we approach the time. Sorry, I just got to pick the pug out of my eye. Nice to see you. I've been out filming in the very charming and very lovely village of Amberley with a gentleman whose birthday it is today, a chap called Rick, who is 61. And as a birthday treat, I was asked if I would take him out for a stroll around the village and make a video, which I have. And it's all good. So, yes. Nice to see you all. Linda says, hello, everyone. Everything okay, Julia? 2 question marks. I think everything's okay. Anyway, hello and welcome once again. London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins. Hello to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Sean James Cameron, who says he loved the video this morning. Would like to see a nighttime version, candlelight up by the fire. I'll have to see if I can arrange that. Zomco Co, nice to see you. Justine Jones, hello to you. Andrew Norris, good afternoon. David Vad, Sensible Paul, Jen Coley, Linda Kane, Billabong O'Neill, Anne H, Linda Kane, did I just say? May have said that. Anyway, hello with all of you and anybody else I missed. If I missed you out, I better apologise. So we're on chapter 62. It's been a romp, hasn't it, this book? It has been a romp. Right, a slurp of coffee as I crack on. It's a lovely sunny day, but my back room here always is a bit chilly, which is why I've got my Harris tweed on. Chapter 62. It was the 3rd day of the petition, and with every hour it was gathering momentum. Admittedly, the first day had been disappointing, decidedly disappointing. Mr. Josser had suffered the indignity of having 3/4 of the front doors in Dulcimer Street closed in his face before he'd even been able to explain what he'd come about. The trouble was that everyone imagined that he was trying to sell something, either that or emergency billeting, or a gas mask check, or even evacuation particulars. And when he did manage to establish his real purpose, there was a new difficulty that no housewife apparently cared to sign anything until she had spoken to her husband, which meant calling again after 7. By tea time on the evening of that first day, when Mr. Josser returned to number 10, he had exactly 23 names on his scroll of paper, and he was tired, so alarmingly tired, that Mrs. Josser advised him to chuck up the whole thing. But that was reckoning without Uncle Henry, and things were different when he took over. He arrived soon after he had closed his shop, as the green bicycle... as soon after the closed shop, after he had closed his shop, as the green bicycle could get him there, and he found fault with everything. The hole and corner way the campaign was being conducted. The absence of organisation, the unimpressive appearance of the scroll of paper itself that Mr. Josser's own half-hearted approaches. Another day lost, he complained, and only 23 signatures to show for it. Not enough to save a cat. What we want is 23 million. Something that will rock the government. Mrs. Josser had not said very much so far. She had simply been listening, tight-lipped, while Uncle Henry had been speaking. But she wasn't going to have anyone, even Uncle Henry, criticising her husband. She intervened suddenly. Well, it isn't going to be Fred who rocks it, she said. He's done enough already. Do you call 23 signatures enough? Uncle Henry demanded. Yes, I do. So far as Fred is concerned, Mrs. Josser answered. If you want any more, you must get 'em yourself. It was your idea. Uncle Henry didn't answer immediately. He was thinking. Not thinking about the petition, but thinking how rude he could be to his sister without ruining everything. In his own mind, he was now calling her the most offensive thing he knew, a petty bourgeois capitalist rentier. Also a crypto-fascist. But these were frightening words, and he dared not utter them. He had set his heart on the petition, and he had to be careful. All right, he said finally. I shall start tomorrow. What? What are you going to do? Mr. Josser asked him. If Mr. Josser hadn't asked him, he would have saved himself a lot of trouble. But as he listened to Uncle Henry's answer, he was spellbound. Here, on his very doorstep, it seemed, was the vast adventure, a crusade with banners, and it was all going to happen without him. Quite suddenly, he forgot all about his tiredness, forgot about the closed doors, forgot about the timid housewives, forgot even about Mrs. Josser. In a flash, he realised that all his life had been craving for adventures and crusades. He could hold back no longer. You can count me in too. You can count me in too, Henry, he said to Mrs. Josser's astonishment. I'll tackle Parliament. After that, everything was easier between Mr. Josser and Uncle Henry. It was only between Mrs. Josser and her brother that a coldness lay. She just sat there watching them, the two crusaders, as though at any moment she might have to intervene and call the crusade off. Then she spoke. Mrs. Boone better do something herself, was what she said. He's her son. Those RCs always stick together. It was only a start, of course, but it was significant. Distinctly it showed softening. In the magnetic field of Uncle Henry's enthusiasm, she was being drawn forward irresistibly. Not only the Catholics, all the churches, Uncle Henry corrected her. They're our chief ally, rightly handled. I'm glad to hear you say so, Mrs. Josser retorted. I've heard different from you in the past. Even opium, Uncle Henry replied coldly, has its uses in emergency. I shall enlist the clergy personally. He paused. We've got a lot of work to do, he added, looking hard to Mr. Josser. Making up for lost time, I shall sleep here. This will be my campaign headquarters. It wasn't Mrs. Josser, but Mrs. Vizard who objected. Mrs. Josser herself had become reconciled to having Uncle Henry in his shirt sleeves, sitting at the dining-room table, surrounded by paper, organising. But Mrs. Vizard would have nothing to do with it. It worried her, and she refused even to add her name to the list of signatures. And, in a way, it was understandable. She still wanted to give Mrs. Boone notice. And all this fuss, was still further thwarting and frustrating her. If she attempted to turn Mrs. Boone out now, she would have to face more than Connie and the Jossers. She would have to face Uncle Henry as well. Nor was Mrs. Vizard alone in her disapproval. She had company in Mr. Puddy. He had his own views on murder, and he was prepared to stand by them. If he did it, I still say, he declared, he deserves it. After all, burder is burder. Mr. Josser, in fact, was in favour of bypassing Mr. Puddy altogether, but Uncle Henry wouldn't hear of it. He went up himself, and he was lucky. Mr. Puddy was just sitting down to a cooked tea, and he was so anxious to get on with it that while it was still hot, that he would have been ready to sign anything. Even Mr. Squales signed eventually. He slipped up quietly, without telling Mrs. Vizard, and added his name in his broad, backward-sloping writing. It looked rather well on the page, and he stood back for a moment, studying the effect. With the right pen and the right coloured ink, he could toss off a signature second to none. And Mr. Squales' signature, together with Connie's and the Jossers, accounted for the whole of number 10. No one had approached Mrs. Boone for hers. That would have seemed somehow indelicate, and they let the list go without it. As it happened, Mr. Josser very nearly stepped off with the wrong foot when he came to tackle Parliament. He tried to introduce something about the petition at the end of an answer to a question in relation to His Majesty's government with Turkey. The Speaker, however, flatly ruled it out of order. After that, Mr. Josser simply had to sit there waiting patiently on the front bench for another half an hour, while, one by one, the members slipped away to their homes, taking their signatures with them. In the Wexford Arms, afterwards, Mr. Josser was able to assemble the few that remained, and he got their signatures without any difficulty, but there was only 11 of them, including Mr. Speaker. He need not have worried. Uncle Henry was doing well enough for 2. Like Mr. Josser, he had met with his rebuffs, but Uncle Henry had buffeted back. In his crusade of the churches, he had started rows with a Methodist lay preacher, a Low Churchman, a Roman Catholic priest, and a Plymouth Brother. And through sheer perseverance, he had at last found what he wanted. He had found the Reverend Headlam Finn, the vicar of St. Jude's. Fanatic recognised fanatic, and the 2 of them went into a corner straight away to discuss things. They made a strange pair, Uncle Henry in his cycling knickers, and the Reverend Headlam Finn in the nearest thing to a monk's habit that the Church of England would stand for. But between them, they certainly got things going. The vicar announced that he would preach on the capital punishment at both Mass and Benediction on Sunday, and have the petition at the church door ready for people to sign as they went out. He also offered to speak at any public meeting, hall or street corner that Uncle Henry cared to arrange. He spoke mysteriously, too, of detailing key members of the Junior Guild of God, of which he was a secretary, to set up centres of outcry, as he called them, in other parts of London. If we are prosecuted for what we do, at least we shall have the thrill, the joy, he said, of knowing that we have dared. It is something to be a daredevil for once in his name. When Uncle Henry came away from the Reverend Headlam Finn, he had that peculiar satisfaction which only born organisers know, the satisfaction of having got something started. In consequence, he was in good temper, almost jocular, in fact, over supper. He became human and intimate, and told them about other campaigns that he had conducted. Campaigns against the eviction of a widow and her 4 children, against the destruction of an ancient doorway, against the closure of a footpath, against Sir Samuel Hoare, against the sale of songbirds in cages. All his life he'd been campaigning against something, and he recognised in this, the campaign of a human life, the ultimate challenge to all campaigners. Uncle Henry, in short, was in clover. The only thing that rattled him was Mrs. Boone. Mrs. Josser insisted on having her down for companionship's sake, and Mrs. Boone obediently came. Supported into the room Supported into the room, she sat down in Mr. Joss's chair, apparently oblivious of everything that was going on around her. She was not excited. She was not grateful. She was not even, so far as he could judge, disturbed. "Everything'll be all right," she said several times. "I know it. Don't you worry." If there was one person with a right to worry, it was Percy. There was a small pocket calendar that Scotty had lent him, and he'd been marking the days off. He knew just where he had got to by now. But at the present moment, there was something wrong with him. He was dreaming. And a very nice dream, too, while it lasted. He wasn't doing anything very much, just waiting at a bus stop. Then a piece came along, walking slowly, like she wanted to be followed, and he went after her. And, sure enough, it was the blonde. They had a drink together and talked about everything that had happened to them both, the struggle in the car and the fatal blow and all that, and it turned out that the blonde didn't mind a bit. She'd forgiven him completely. Just to prove it, she kissed him full on the lips, and he was surprised to find how a dead girl could kiss. Because, of course, he knew all the time, the way people do know things in dreams, that she was dead. It was because of the kiss, the first kiss that he'd been given for more than 2 months now, that he woke up crying. And went on crying, even after he was awake. Scotty didn't take any notice of him at first, just left him so that he could get over it. Then, when he didn't stop, and Scotty couldn't stand it any more, he got up and went over to him. "Don't take on so," he said kindly. "It isn't going to hurt. It'll all be over. It's all over so quickly you won't feel anything." Chapter 63. A piece. Linda Kane. I had to look at that line. I'd flicked my eyes and went, "What? Oh, I see what you mean." And then I thought, oh, hello. Oh, you got to laugh, haven't you? Mr. Puddy had cut his hand. On his birthday, too. And with a tin opener. He'd been levering away at a prime cut of Alaskan salmon when the metal shaft of the opener went clean up through the wooden handle and lacerated him. What made it so particularly maddening was that the tin, except for a small corrugated indentation on one side, was practically as it had left the canners, which meant that Mr. Puddy, one-handed and left-handed at that, had been forced to sit down to plain bread and margarine while his fish course stood on the table beside him in an inaccessible tin, as if the salmon were still alive, jumping up and down in its original Columbian river. "What a mishap," Mr. Puddy told himself sadly. "On my birthday too. 55 and no supper." And because it was 3 o'clock in the morning, he was cut off from all hope of assistance. A night watchman's is a solitary calling. He has to be practically as self-supporting as a trapper. There was, right in the centre of London, with tens of million people all around him. There he was in the centre of London with 10 millions of people all around him, and all he could do, for goodness sake, Mr. Vobes, there he was in the centre of London with 10 millions of people all around him, and he couldn't so much as borrow a tin opener from one of them. The sense of separation, simply because when he was on the job everyone else was off it, played upon his nerves somehow, and left him jumpy. "Suppose I was to fall ill, poisoning, or heart attack, or something like that," he reflected. "I should just lie here till boarding. I should be on the floor when the cleaners come in. It was because of these grim fancies that Mr. Puddy always tried to break up the silent monotony of watching. He was careful to keep his mind off himself, and he did it mainly by spacing out his eating. Coming on duty, winter and summer alike, he always began by getting himself a drop of something hot. And it was the simple fact that it was hot that rendered him so estimable. His predecessor in the basement cubbyhole and his predecessor before him had both lost their jobs precisely because it was a drop of something cold that they were always taking. And that, in watching-keeping circles, is ruination. A drunk night watchman, even a night watchman with liquor on his breath, is professionally finished. Once discovered, he is unemployable. But Mr. Puddy had got it all planned out. First, there was a cup of something hot, the freshener. Then, because it is a long stretch from 6 o'clock to midnight, he always had a snack around about 9, say a small piece of pie or some sort, or a few sausages, an apple, and then his sandwiches at 10 to 12. The real sit-down, the tin stuff, came on at 3, when the human spirit is at its lowest. He took a drop more of something hot, cocoa usually, at 6, just to keep him going, and with a parting cuppa for the road at 7:30, he was through. In between, he made his rounds and washed up. The washing up was all right because he was used to it. It was the hours of inspection that got him down. There was something positively eerie about patrolling that enormous building all alone at night. And not only eerie, but fatiguing. Imagine yourself doing it. Nearly an acre of floor space, 4 stories and a basement, and no lifts working after 6:30. No lifts and 58 stairs. It was partly his weight that did for him. Whereas a little fellow could have nipped up and down those stairs without noticing it, Mr. Puddy climbed slowly and suffered. Climb he had to, because there was a blasted clocking-in device on every floor that had to be punched when he got to it, and wouldn't punch itself if he didn't get there. It's very interesting because I actually had a job, I spoke about this in one of my videos, but I had a very similar job, which is very curious to read this now. So, punctually at 12, I didn't eat like he ate by any means, just so you know. So, punctually at 12 every night, he would set out, ready for action, carrying the full regalia of his office, his electric torch, his bunch of keys, his police whistle. If any burglar had been about, Mr. Puddy would certainly have alarmed him. There was nearly 15 stone of him, remember, and his bowler hat on top, which seemed to carry with it something official, a touch, as it were, of the plain-clothes man. But rats are no respecter of even a bowler hat, and the rats are one of the big chief worries of tea importers. Sometimes in the night, Mr. Puddy had to take a stick with him. Then the silence, the unnatural, unearthly silence of the tea warehouse, would be shattered by the sound of blows. That would be Mr. Puddy banging on the side of one of the packing cases to scare away the vermin. He rarely came to close grips with them. He rarely came to closer grips with them than that, rarely hit out at one of the rats themselves, because they were far too nimble for him. But for the most part, these patrols of Mr. Puddy's were uneventful. It was, indeed, precisely this uneventfulness that rendered them so uncanny. he would open up the heavy sliding door at the end of one of the storage bays, and there, stretching before him in the tunnel of light from his torch, would be the endless double row of cases, all the same size, all stacked one on top of the other, all glittering along the reinforced metal edges. It was the unvarying sameness that got him down, for at the end of a long bay there would be another corridor of cases, just like the first one, and after that, and another after that, and another after that. Sometimes the cases threatened to come together and crush him, so that Mr. Puddy, on one of his bad evenings, that is, would simply walk as fast as he could to the clocking-in machine at the far end, punch it, and examine the next bay without actually walking the length of it. Not that you could blame him. It was a queer business, being the one living creature, except for the rats, among the multitude of boxes. And in the light of his torch, the boxes cast long, fantastic shadows. All connection with the tea trade disappeared, and then Mr. Puddy, night watchman no longer, might have been exploring the deserted midnight ruins of Thebes or Connacht. There was, of course, always the smell. On the first floor you were greeted by rich Darjeeling and ripe Assam, on the second by the cheaper Chinas, and on the third by the really aromatic stuff, the Picos and the Lapsings, and down in the basement by dust, sweepings and dried grass stalks. Even if you just shut your eyes, you could still tell what floor you were on. But when Mr. Puddy had a cold, even that clue went too. Tonight, his birthday night, had been a particularly bad one for him. Low-blooded and out of sorts when he had started work, the incident of the salmon had depressed him even more than he had realised. It seemed yet another piece of unsuccess with which to taunt himself. Shuffling along the bays, torch in hand, he couldn't help comparing the present with other and better birthdays that he had known. "What I ought to have by rights," he grumbled to himself aloud, "is a built round with an horse, something on wheels, a little shob with an assistant. Then I wouldn't be here now. I'd be in bed, asleep." He turned the corner and his torch alighted on a large red notice that said, "Danger of fire. No smoking." In his present state, the notice annoyed him. "That's another thing," he told himself. "No smogging. Might as well be in prison. I could tell the company this much. Watchman or no watchman, if the warehouse catches fire, it catches fire. I'm not going to stop here and put it out for nobody." He had reached the last bay by now, and his tour, save for one small extra excursion, was over. During the night he was supposed to go outside and examine the main gates to the yard, and this was something that he always did, except when it was foggy, or very cold, or raining. Chapter 64. I like Mr. Puddy. I think he's a great character. The extraordinary thing about the petition was that it wasn't Uncle Henry's petition any longer. It was the Reverend Headlam Finn's. Within 24 hours of the enrolment of this formidable new recruit, Uncle Henry had been thrust to the wall. The character of the street corner protest meetings had changed beyond recognition. They now opened with a prayer and a hymn to end them, and even the campaign notepaper had changed. The heading now read, "A petition for Christian clemency, addressed by the obedient citizens of London to the King, most gracious Majesty." Admittedly, it had taken hours of hard committee work to get Uncle Henry to agree, but the fact remained that he had agreed. He had, in short, been talked down, overruled and trampled over. Even so, had the Reverend Headlam Finn been content with a prayer here and an amendment there, the petition would probably have gone the quiet, unheeded way of most petitions. But he was not content. During the terrifyingly short time that remained, he forsook everything: Bible class, zenana teas, and whist drives, and like a good shepherd he strove for the one strayed lamb. He lived the part. He dressed the part. In particular, he dressed the part. He didn't wear his long lounge suit once. His flowing black robe and his buckle shoes were set out beside his bed each night, and he emerged each morning in full habit. Not that it was vanity that prompted him. The Reverend Headlam Finn had lived through that stage long ago. It was the sheer showmanship and common sense that prompted him. He knew from long experience that there is nothing that collects a crowd quicker than a clergyman in a habit. It awakens whole centuries of prejudice. But it was the Scarlet Cross that finally did the trick. Nearly 8 feet tall and made of plywood, he had previously carried it with him only when preaching in the open. Now he took it with him everywhere. And the sight of the athletic priest, his college oar was hung alongside the crucifix in his little study, dressed like something out of the Inquisition and carrying an 8'4" cross, as bright as a pillar box, naturally caused a sensation. As soon as he left the vicarage, crowds of children, all that the LCC scheme had left, followed him. By the time he reached Dulcimer Street, it was like the arrival of the Pied Piper. The first time Mrs. Vizard saw him through the basement window, she could not believe it. She thought it must be a medical students from St. Thomas collecting. Then, when the black-gowned figure swept up the front steps, her front steps, and into the house, her house, she realised that this was one more indignity that the Boones had just heaped upon her. And there was worse to it than that. Even after the front door had closed again, the roadway and the railings outside remained littered with unevacuated urchins. And she couldn't go up and chase them away because that would have been very unladylike. Nor could she stay where she was because the sight was unbearable. In the result, she withdrew. Shamed and humiliated, she threw herself on the bed. But not to rest. She had been lying down for hardly 10 minutes when there was a knock at the door. She rose, smoothed herself, and went upstairs. It was the press. She was just on the point of sending the reporter away when the door opened and Uncle Henry came hurrying down. He was brisk and agitated, and his manners were intolerable. Without asking her permission, scarcely even acknowledging her indeed, he took the little man by the arm and led him upstairs. Mrs. Vizard turned. On the first landing, a great black shape was standing, and she heard a rich baritone voice say, "Ah, a friend from Fleet Street. It is the moment for which we have been waiting." And it was only the beginning. A photographer and a lady feature writer arrived later. But Uncle Henry was on the alert now. He worked upstairs with the door open and came down every time he thought he heard anything. The letters to editors had been his idea. With the house full of people in this way, it was not surprising that things went wrong. Connie put on her hat with the feather peony. I know Julius told me how to pronounce this word, and I can't remember now. Peony, is it? In it, and was photographed on the doorstep holding a great bunch of papers, all prominently headed Petition. But what particularly disgusted Mrs. Vizard was the fact that Mr. Squales of all people, somehow got himself mixed up with the interviews. It was only his abnormally good manners, she did not doubt, that had made it impossible for him to extract himself. Out of her sight, only for a moment, she found him pinned to the wall by the lady feature writer. Her notebook was open in her hand. Mr. Squales's dark eyes were fixed upon the creature, and he was saying very slowly and distinctly, "Qualito is the name. Qualito." Mrs. Vizard turned away. Her eyes filled with tears. "And I've always tried to keep this house quiet and respectable," she told herself. "It was, till Mrs. Boone came here. That settles it. She goes." But this was unfair, because the only other person in number 10 who appreciated all the publicity as little as Mrs. Vizard was Mrs. Boone herself. Aloof and detached from everything she was going on around her, she remained in her room, seeing no one. And in this Mrs. Josser assisted her. Connie, Uncle Henry, the strange clergyman, even her own husband, would answer all the questions the reporter and the feature lady writer cared to put to them, but she wasn't going to have Mrs. Boone upset. "She's sleeping and she cannot be disturbed," was what she said whenever they inquired about her. Not that they would have got anything, even had they been allowed to see Mrs. Boone. "It's very kind of them to take all this trouble," she had said earlier that afternoon. "Indeed, that's Mrs. Boone. It's very kind of them to take all that trouble," she'd said earlier that afternoon. "Very kind indeed, but they really needn't bother. Percy's going to be all right. I know he is." But Percy appreciated the petition all right, and the change it produced in him. And the change that it produced in him was remarkable. Moody and apathetic for the past few days, he suddenly perked up when Scotty showed him the papers. The blackness fell from his mind, and his face lit up again. "There's me on the front page," he said. "That's Mr. Barks doing, or Mr. Veasy Blaze. That's me in my pinstripe." Then he came to the lady feature writer's article. There was a whole column of it, and it took him some time to read. It was nice seeing his name so often, but it was funny being called Percy all the way through. It was as though she knew him, and he'd never heard of her. When he finished, he turned to Scotty. "What does she mean?" she asked. "What's an oval-born Lothario?" Lothario? I mean, even I'm asking that question. What is he? Is it a character from fiction? Oval, as in London, born. Lothario. What is an oval-born Lothario? A Lothario born in oval, presumably. Chapter 65, ladies and gentlemen. Well remembered, says the lovely Julia. Yes, 6:30 and it's tea time. Chapter 65. There was no time to be lost. The calendar on the Home Secretary's desk had the day after tomorrow conspicuously ringed round in red. And there was a special reason for it. Dates with red rings round them were dates set for executions. Not that the preceding days had been unrewardful. On the contrary, the petition had allowed a snowball momentum of its own, and every post... On the contrary, the petition had acquired a snowball of momentum of its own, and every post brought in a mysterious bulky envelopes from outlying parts, all containing names, more names. Some of them came from the most unlikeliest quarters. Even Connie had managed to secure 24 signatures from a nightclub. They were written on rather shiny paper with an Apollinarius heading. And except for one man, a drunk who had signed twice, and for another, only half drunk, who had signed in the name of the Nazi party leaders, the list seemed valid. Under Uncle Henry's supervision, Mr. Josser had been sticking the various bits together. On this point, on the continuous scroll of names, Mr. Henry was emphatic and unshakable, because it didn't matter in the least. The Reverend Headlam Finn gave way. If it's in separate pieces, they could run through it like that, Uncle Henry said with a contemptuous whisk of the hand. But if it is in a colossal scroll, they'll see at once what they're up against. They'll recognise their own winding sheet. And so, with paste and the help of large sheets of brown paper, the petition was prepared, ready for presentation. There was now some 22 feet of it, and nearly 4,000 signatures. When rolled up, it made a bundle about the size of a small barrel. Mr. Josser signed it laboriously. Oh, no, he didn't. He's already signed it. What did he say? He signed it. He did sign. I would have thought he had already signed it. Anyway, I suppose we'll have to get a taxi, he said. It's a pity. He stopped himself abruptly. He had nearly said that it was a pity that Percy wasn't there to drive him. But the Reverend Headlam Finn wouldn't hear of a taxi. No, he said. No, not by taxi. No one will notice us. We will lose everything. We must march. March? The idea appealed to Uncle Henry immediately. Even his sound eye was rolling now. Over Westminster Bridge and past the Commons, he said exultantly, into Whitehall and up the steps of the Home Office, right into the fortress of reaction. And one of us carry that? Mr. Josser said, pointing at the roll he'd just been sticking. The Reverend Headlam Finn paused. It certainly was a formidable packet, the petition. Well, perhaps not carry it, he replied. Push it. In what? It was Mrs. Josser who had spoken. She had been hovering around the outside of the committee, interested and helpful as occasion demanded, but still frankly sceptical. The Reverend Headlam Finn shrugged his broad black shoulders. In a pram or a mail cart, he answered. The exact vehicle is immaterial. Mrs. Josser looked from the Reverend Headlam Finn to Uncle Henry, and then to Mr. Josser. Fred's not going to push it, is all she said. Not in public, he isn't. Oh, Lee Lawson says the name Lothario, is that how it's pronounced, comes from a character in a play of 1703. Ah. And Linda Kane says it's Lothario, a lover, a man who behaves selfishly and irresponsibly in his sexual relationships with women. Well, that's explained who I am then. This question, however, did not arise when the time came. Instead of finding someone to do the pushing, there was competition for it. Because it was a bassinet borrowed from one of his parishioners, the Reverend Headlam Finn felt himself entitled to say who should direct it. But Uncle Henry felt differently. You leave this to me, he said. You've got that cross of yours to look after. The Reverend Headlam Finn raised his eyebrows. We can take it in turns, he answered. First one will take the bassinet and then the other. Uncle Henry shook his head. Not me with the cross, he said firmly. I'll stick to the pram. There was another awkward pause. The Reverend Headlam Finn was annoyed. As you please, he said. Time is slipping past us while we argue. There were seven of them altogether. The Reverend Headlam Finn went first, carrying the cross. Then came Uncle Henry, wheeling the perambulator. After him walked Mr. Josser and Connie. Behind them were two lay evangelists from the Junior Guild of God, and in the rear marched a pale elderly lady, a stranger who fell in place, saying, "The few of us who feel this way must see it doesn't happen." They were joined at intervals by such small boys as were temporarily disengaged, at crossroads by policemen who conducted the little cortege safely across. In Mr. Josser's calculation, it was just half an hour from number 10 to the Home Office, and so it would have been, except for two mishaps. The first was the weather. Dark and overcast when they left Dulcimer Street, it was already drizzling by the time they reached the Oval. The two lay evangelists were all right. They had umbrellas. And so had Mr. Josser. He and Connie shared. But the Reverend Headlam Finn had nothing, not even a hat. He simply shook the dampness from his hair, held his head high, and marched on. He was no worse off, in point of fact, than Uncle Henry, for even if Uncle Henry had been carrying an umbrella, it would have been impossible for him to use it. The perambulator was taking up all his attention. He seemed to be finding difficulty in wheeling it on a straight and satisfactory course. Then the drizzle changed to rain, without warning. At one moment they were walking through the light, filmy stuff that reduced spray, and at the next the raindrops were beating on their faces. The Reverend Headlam Finn kept shaking himself like a terrier, and the elderly lady in the rear said, half to herself and half to Mr. Josser, "It's nothing, it's just sent to try us." But the elderly lady was wrong. It was far from nothing. Almost as she said the words, the real storm broke. The rain came pelting down in monsoon fashion. The broad black bosom of the Reverend Headlam Finn was soaking, and the folds of his habit collected the water in channels. He turned and addressed his followers. "This is too much," he said. "We must—" He did not finish his sentence because at that moment he was run into. Uncle Henry, head down, had been ploughing his way through the downpour and stopped for no one. The front of the pram, the hard part, drove full into the leader. Indeed, it was only the plywood of the cross that saved him. "Careful, careful," he said. "Festina lente, remember." If he had been irritated earlier by Uncle Henry, he was now downright angry with him. Rubbing himself where it hurt, he led the party to the doorway of a shop. They sheltered there while the swollen raindrops burst like small watery crocuses in the swirling street. All except Uncle Henry. He was out in the thick of it, trying to get the hood up. It seemed a difficult sort of hood. By the time he'd got it fixed, he was more than ordinarily wet. He was sodden. He came back and stood among them, steaming. The deluge was not a long one, however. Within 20 minutes the rain had stopped and they were able to move on again. But those 20 lost minutes were important. They were vital. Instead of being in comfortable time, they were now late, definitely late. They had to hurry, and it was because of this, directly because of it, that the second mishap occurred. The Reverend Headlam Finn was striding on ahead, and the rest of the procession was following up behind, when suddenly there was a cry from Uncle Henry. He was in difficulties, appalling difficulties. The perambulator was upright only because he was holding it, and after a moment the others saw what was happening. The thing was running on only 3 wheels. The fourth wheel, the one that had gone careering off on its own like a small hoop, was recovered later by one of the lay evangelists. This time the delay was really serious. So serious, in fact, that the Reverend Headlam Finn proposed taking the bundle of names under his arm and walking, but Uncle Henry wouldn't have it. He refused point blank to hand the scroll over. It would be only a matter of minutes, he said, to get the wheel back on again, and in a sense he was right, but only in a sense. For with the hubcap missing, Gone down a drain somewhere, Connie suggested. The wheel came off again, and Uncle Henry would not let them start until it was mended properly. In the result, they were still there 10 minutes later, and Uncle Henry was saying that if only he'd got his tool bag with him, everything would have been fixed up by now. It was the Reverend Headlam Finn who reminded him of the consequences of his tinkering. "If this petition means anything," he said sternly, "we must deliver it." Uncle Henry got up off his knees and straightened himself up. "I didn't provide the pram," he answered. "I'm only trying to mend it." "And have you?" "I have not. It's too old and too broken. We go as we are. I'm ready." With that, Uncle Henry gripped hold of the handle of the pram and started off with it. It was not easy, but Uncle Henry was determined. Setting his shoulders to take up the uneven strain, he persisted. The thing fairly rattled along. The Reverend Headlam Finn even had to double up to get his rightful place at the head of the procession. But the half an hour that they had lost in all was irreplaceable, and as though to remind them of this, dusk was now falling. The little column, cross in front, trampled through the darkened streets under the steely sky. And it may have been the grim luring of the landscape and the grey streets and the unlighted houses, or the distance they had come, or the fear that they were already too late, or simply that they were thinking of Percy. Whatever it was, dusk fell into their spirits too, and they were silent. A small, silent crusade with the citadel in sight. As soon as they had passed St. Thomas's and the county hall, they could see Big Ben with the hands standing accusingly at 5:10. The Reverend Headlam Finn instinctively stepped out, and Uncle Henry, bent almost double, pushed harder. The wide camber of the bridge, Westminster Bridge, stretched out before them, and they began to cross it. And as they did so, the sudden wide expanse of black heaven and the smooth sliding water underneath isolated them. Even to themselves they seemed a pathetically small contingent to go challenging the state. There was a traffic block at Parliament Square, and they had to stand there for a moment, motionless. It was only when they had stopped that Mr. Josser realised how tired he was, tired and shaky. He took off his bowler hat and he passed his handkerchief around the inside of the lining. He was dimly aware that people on the pavement were staring, but he didn't mind any more. Somewhere on the march he had ceased to care about anything. "It'd probably been better without any of us," he thought, "and so would she. Better for both of them if we just let it happen and didn't interfere." They were on the point of moving again when Connie saw something, and because she was the only one who spotted it, she made a dive out of the line so that she could find out for certain. She came back a moment later, waving the evening paper in her hand. "Take it easy, boys," she said. "It's all off." They crowded round to read the stop press column that Connie was holding out to them. But they needn't have troubled. It was there in the chalk letters on the newspaper board that Connie had first spotted. "Car murderer, reprieved," is what it said. The sudden ending of the tension, the snapping of the frightful and burning urgency that had been supporting them, left the little party flat and at a loose end. There they were, useless and unwanted, with a plywood cross and a perambulator, 2 miles from home, tired and soaked through, and with the sky looking as though at any moment it would start raining again. Nerves and tempers were frayed and jagged, and before Mr. Josser could do anything to stop it, Uncle Henry and the Reverend Headlam Finn had got into an argument together. And I do understand that you still believe in a merciful God, Mr. Josser heard Uncle Henry saying. More than ever, the Reverend Headlam Finn replied. Oh, so much more. Look at what he's just done. You call it merciful to keep that poor boy locked up for a couple of months with the threat of the gallows hanging over him? It wasn't God who... It wasn't God who did that. It was man. Uncle Henry fixed his eyes, fixed him with his sound eye. And who was it that saved him? It was God that guided the Home Secretary, the Reverend Headlam Finn replied, guardedly. Then why didn't he guide the judge? Uncle Henry demanded. Wasn't he feeling quite so merciful then? This time the Reverend Headlam Finn did not answer him. He was looking at his hands. They were scarlet, like the cross. As a result of the rain, the colour had begun to run. The Reverend Headlam Finn wiped his hands on the front of his habit, and then regretted it. Even his black hair bore a broad scarlet streak on it now. He looked as though he'd gashed himself. When he found out what had happened, it was his best habit. He lost his temper. I refuse to stand here any longer listening to your silly blasphemies, he said. You are no better than an atheist. No better? Uncle Henry began, but it was too late. One of the lay evangelists had hailed a passing taxi, and together they bundled the Reverend Headlam Finn into it. Without even a word of farewell and an abandoning of the pram, the property of one of his parishioners, the Reverend Headlam was swept away from them. Well, that's it, said Connie. There goes His Holiness. She screwed her neck backwards so that she could peer up at Big Ben. It was 5:30. Oh, duty calls. Cheerio, chaps. Then she glanced down at the three-wheeled perambulator up against the curb and gave a little giggle. Can I trust you two lads with the baby? She asked. When she had gone, Uncle Henry turned to Mr. Josser. Let's park this damn thing up somewhere in a side street and go and get a drink, he said. I'm cold. And there, ladies and gentlemen, we leave chapter 65 for we're on chapter 66, which, yes, you've guessed it, we will get to tomorrow. So the petition, all of that for nothing. He was reprieved by the Home Office as a matter of fact. Who would have thought? But there we are. How brilliant. Anyway, I hope you're still enjoying it. We're rattling towards the end now of this. I guess it's all going to calm down once Percy comes out. Thank goodness. Reliant Robin comes to mind, yes, or even a Robin Reliant. That's true. Festina lente. Make haste slowly, apparently, says Linda Kane. Ah, Festina lente, remember? I used to play the Lothario, but we lost our drummer. Oh, says Michael White. Very good. Anyway, there we go. Thank you very much. My goodness, what a wonderful reading. Thank you so much, Richard. Have a wonderful evening. See you tomorrow. Yes, indeed. Brilliant. Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining me. We all get the evening off tonight, so have a good evening, whatever it is you're doing. I have got some steak this evening and some mashed potato. I've got to go and light my Essie, of course. So I will catch up with you tomorrow. I've got a lovely little video tomorrow with a birthday boy of 61. There's always something different on the old Vobes stuff, isn't there? Anyway, take care. And, oh, that's the point that the film ended, says Edward Moulding. Yes, I seem to remember the film sort of fizzled, didn't it? I hope the book doesn't fizzle. I can't remember what happens to the book, but he does like... I like his sagas, these sort of, sagas of all these different people. It's marvellous. Anyway, there we go. Thank you very much for watching. Catch up with you tomorrow. Take care, one and all, and see you then. Bye for now.